Most people believe financial problems come from one bad decision, one reckless purchase, one financial mistake, something obvious. But modern financial pressure is often built very differently. Not through one dramatic event, through repetition. Small behaviors repeated so consistently, they eventually become invisible. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston, your synthetic financial educator. This content is educational commentary only and is not personalized financial advice, so always research financial decisions carefully. One of the most powerful financial forces in modern life is repetition. Because repeated behavior quietly shapes financial structure over time, not instantly, gradually. Small purchases, small subscriptions, small conveniences, small recurring obligations operating continuously underneath everyday life. And individually, most of these decisions genuinely feel harmless. That's what makes repetition psychologically powerful, because people rarely notice structural change while it's happening slowly. Now, this does not mean small purchases are automatically bad. That's not the point. The deeper issue is cumulative behavior, because repeated systems quietly compound underneath awareness across years. And once repetition becomes emotionally automatic, people often stop evaluating the system itself. That matters enormously. Now, another important factor here is friction, because friction slows behavior down. Years ago, many purchases required more effort. People physically handled cash, drove to stores, waited longer, experienced visible spending. Modern systems operate very differently. Tap to pay, one-click ordering, automatic renewals, stored payment methods, everything increasingly designed around reducing pause moments. And reduced friction changes repeated behavior automatically over time. Because the easier behavior feels emotionally, the easier repetition becomes psychologically. Now, another important layer here is normalization, because human beings normalize repeated behavior extremely quickly. At first, a subscription feels noticeable. Then, eventually, it feels invisible. At first, convenience spending feels occasional. Then, eventually, it feels emotionally standard. And once behavior becomes normalized, people stop consciously evaluating it deeply. That's one reason modern financial pressure often feels mysterious emotionally. People experience the pressure without fully recognizing the repeated systems quietly creating the pressure underneath the surface. Now, another important factor here is emotional exhaustion. Because exhausted people naturally prioritize convenience, that's normal. A stressful day increases low-friction decisions. Impulse behavior increases. Delivery spending increases. Convenience spending increases, not because people are weak, because overloaded minds naturally conserve energy. And modern systems increasingly understand how emotional exhaustion affects spending behavior. That's one reason convenience-focused systems become so psychologically effective during stressful periods. Now, another important layer here involves automation, because modern financial life increasingly operates automatically. Subscriptions renew automatically, payments happen automatically, purchases save automatically, streaming services continue automatically, and automatic systems often reduce visibility psychologically. That matters because visibility creates awareness. Without awareness, repetition becomes increasingly invisible underneath everyday life. Now, another important factor here is attention. Modern environments constantly compete for attention. Notifications, advertisements, algorithms, consumer platforms designed around continuous engagement, and fragmented attention reduces reflection naturally. That matters because reflection creates pause moments, and pause moments create awareness. Without pauses, behavior often becomes increasingly automatic underneath the surface. Now, another important reason repeated behaviors become financially powerful is because small recurring obligations quietly reduce flexibility over time. One subscription seems small, one payment seems manageable, one convenience upgrade seems harmless, and individually, many of those decisions genuinely are manageable. That's the important part. Financial pressure rarely appears all at once. It usually develops through repeated normalization operating quietly across years. Small, recurring obligations accumulating gradually underneath awareness. Now, another important factor here is identity. Because modern culture strongly associates convenience with quality of life. Faster services, easier systems, more comfort, more upgrades, and repeated exposure quietly changes emotional expectations over time. Not because people consciously choose comparison constantly, because human beings naturally adapt to surrounding environments psychologically. Now, eventually, certain conveniences stop feeling optional emotionally. They simply begin feeling normal. And once expectations normalize upward, maintaining those systems often becomes emotionally important. Now, another important layer here is emotional spending. Because many purchases are not driven purely by logic. Stress spending, reward spending, convenience spending, exhaustion spending, and repeated emotional spending patterns often become normalized underneath awareness over time. Now, this does not mean emotional spending makes someone irresponsible. Human beings are emotional creatures, that's normal. The deeper issue is understanding how repeated emotional behaviors quietly shape long-term financial structure. Now, another important factor here is invisibility. Because repeated systems often become hardest to notice once they become routine. The payment disappears into the background. The renewal disappears into the background. The convenience disappears into the background. And eventually, the larger structure becomes difficult to evaluate clearly while operating continuously. Now, another important layer here involves adaptation. Because human beings adapt to repeated environments psychologically, fast delivery becomes expected, instant convenience becomes expected, subscription access becomes expected, and eventually convenience itself stops feeling luxurious. It simply feels emotionally standard. That changes expectations quietly underneath the surface. Now, another important factor here is behavioral momentum. Because repeated systems create repeated behavior, and repeated behavior often becomes emotionally automatic over time. People stop making fully conscious decisions. They begin following routines, patterns, automatic cycles operating underneath awareness. That matters enormously. Because automatic behavior often shapes financial life more powerfully than occasional large decisions. Now, another important reason repetition matters is because repeated behavior influences future expectations psychologically. Convenience changes standards. Faster systems change patience. Low-friction environments change spending behavior. And over time, people often begin structuring everyday life around systems they barely consciously notice anymore. Now, another important layer here involves emotional bandwidth. Because repeated obligations consume attention continuously underneath everyday life. Not always dramatically, quietly. The bill, the subscription, the payment, the recurring maintenance operating constantly underneath the surface. And once enough recurring systems accumulate simultaneously, financial life often begins feeling emotionally heavier underneath the surface. Now, another important factor here is comparison. Modern environments constantly expose people to curated lifestyles, curated convenience, curated comfort, curated upgraded living, and repeated exposure quietly changes emotional expectations automatically over time. Not because people consciously compare themselves constantly, because human beings naturally adapt to surrounding environments psychologically. Now, eventually, upgraded convenience stops feeling luxurious. It simply begins feeling emotionally standard. And once standards normalize upward, maintaining those systems often becomes emotionally automatic. Now, another important reason repeated systems matter is because behavior compounds, not only financially, psychologically. Repeated convenience changes expectation. Repeated spending changes normalization. Repeated low-friction behavior changes decision-making. And repeated systems quietly shape long-term financial structure underneath awareness. Now, another important factor here is environment. Because environment strongly influences repeated behavior. A convenience-focused environment encourages convenience behavior. A low-friction environment encourages faster spending. An overstimulated environment encourages impulsive behavior. And modern systems increasingly combine all three simultaneously. That combination matters enormously, because repeated environmental influence often becomes emotionally invisible once it feels normal enough. Now, another important layer here involves speed. Modern financial systems move extremely quickly. Purchases happen instantly. Payments happen invisibly. Subscriptions continue automatically, and fast-moving systems naturally reduce reflection. That matters because reflection creates awareness. Without awareness, behavior often becomes increasingly automatic underneath everyday life. Now, another important reason this discussion matters is because many people blame themselves for patterns they were never properly taught to recognize structurally. They assume they lack discipline, they lack self-control, they are simply bad with money. But modern financial environments are increasingly optimized around repeated engagement and repeated behavior. And repeated behavior naturally becomes normalized over time. Now, if you step back and observe the broader pattern, something important becomes very clear. Small behaviors repeat. Repeated behaviors normalize. Normalized behaviors become automatic. Automatic systems quietly shape long-term financial structure underneath awareness, which means modern financial pressure is often not caused by one catastrophic mistake alone. Often it is built through repeated systems operating quietly across years underneath everyday life. Now, understanding this should not create guilt. Guilt rarely improves clarity. The goal is awareness because awareness changes observation, and observation changes behavior gradually over time. Instead of viewing financial life purely through isolated purchases or isolated mistakes, people begin recognizing larger systems operating underneath everyday behavior. Convenience systems, normalization systems, recurring obligation systems, attention systems, and once those systems become visible, financial life often stops feeling completely random emotionally. Not instantly, not perfectly, but progressively. Because invisible systems are usually the hardest systems to evaluate clearly. Not because they are unbeatable, but because people stop recognizing how often those systems quietly shape behavior underneath modern life itself. Now, financial life is rarely shaped by one dramatic event alone. It is usually shaped through repeated systems operating quietly across time. Small conveniences, small recurring obligations, small normalized behaviors accumulating gradually underneath awareness. And once those patterns become visible, many people begin realizing something important. Their financial stress was not always caused by one huge mistake. Often it was shaped by repeated systems they were never properly taught to recognize clearly. And understanding that changes how modern financial behavior itself gets interpreted moving forward. Less emotionally, more structurally, more intentionally. Because repeated systems become easier to navigate once people stop viewing them as isolated choices and begin recognizing how those systems quietly shape everyday life underneath the surface. That concludes today's lesson. Peace. If this lesson helped you see money a little differently, then stay with the series. Because financial understanding is not built from one idea. It is built layer by layer. One system, one pattern, one hidden behavior at a time. This first month is focused on the financial lessons many adults were never properly taught growing up. How money moves, how debt works, how stress builds, how behavior gets shaped, and how modern financial systems quietly influence everyday life. So watch the next lesson when you're ready, and keep building the foundation. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston. Peace.